Have you ever wondered why silence can speak louder than any confession, louder than any plea, louder even than words of love? For some women, silence is not an absence of sound, but an invisible storm that reshapes the air around her. To the masculine mind, conditioned by conquest, affirmation, and ego-driven pursuits, this silence is maddening. It is not compliance, nor is it weakness. It is the language of detachment, of hidden strength, and of a mystery that Carl Jung would have called the anima's unspoken power. A woman who knows when not to speak transcends the ordinary battlefield of relationships. She no longer tries to convince, to argue, to prove her worth. Instead, her quiet detachment forces a man into confrontation with himself. He begins to hear echoes of his own doubts, the rattling of his insecurities, and the restless scratching of his shadow. Silence becomes a mirror, and in that mirror he sees everything he has been running from: his fear of abandonment, his hunger for validation, his obsession with control. The irony is cruel but exquisite. The less a woman says, the more his thoughts multiply. Her silence draws out his obsession because the masculine psyche is not built to rest in uncertainty. He wants answers, closure, clarity, but when none come, he is left with only the sound of his own mind unraveling. In Jungian terms, he projects his anima onto her, trying to grasp what she represents within himself. And yet, the more he tries to define her, the more elusive she becomes. This is the alchemy of feminine power. You have seen it play out in subtle moments. A woman withdraws her attention, and suddenly the man who once seemed indifferent begins to chase. He may tell himself that he doesn't care, but at night, when the world quiets, he cannot escape the hollow silence that replaces her voice. His ego trembles, for it realizes it is not the center of her world. He tastes the bitterness of being replaceable. That bitterness quickly curdles into longing, then obsession. What would you think if I told you that a woman's silence is more seductive than the sweetest words? Because silence does not flatter. It does not appease. It does not bow to the fragile male ego. Instead, it unsettles, and in that unsettling it awakens desire. Men are drawn to what they cannot fully possess, to what resists their grasp. The silent woman is like a locked door in his dreamscape. He cannot help but try to open it again and again, though the key forever slips from his hands. This power is not cruel for cruelty's sake. It is a spiritual discipline. Seneca once wrote that true strength lies in mastery of the self, not in mastery of others. For a woman, silence becomes that mastery. She is no longer reactive, no longer enslaved by the need to answer every question or soothe every wound. She knows that words can be wasted on ears unwilling to listen. Instead, she conserves her energy, holds her truth within, and lets the silence do the work. To the man who is unprepared, this silence feels like rejection, like a punishment. But in reality, it is an invitation to meet himself, to step into his shadow, to confront the very emptiness he has avoided. Few accept the invitation, for it demands humility, but those who do find themselves changed. They begin to see that the woman was never withholding. She was simply refusing to play the ego's endless games. And you, yes, you listening now, must understand this. Silence is not about ignoring him to manipulate or to punish. It is about knowing your worth so deeply that you no longer need to explain it. It is about withdrawing from battles that drain your spirit and stepping into the sacred space of your own self-possession. It is about embodying the truth that not everything deserves your reaction, your energy, or your voice. A man may be infatuated with a woman's beauty, but it is her silence that haunts him. Because beauty can be seen, touched, and praised, but silence cannot be pinned down. It lingers in the spaces between moments, in the pauses where he expects reassurance and finds none. In those spaces, his obsession grows because silence makes him feel powerless, and nothing unsettles the masculine ego more than the loss of power. In Jung's language, this is the dance of the opposites, the eternal pull between anima and animus, between projection and reality. The man thinks he is chasing the woman, but in truth, he is chasing the fragmented pieces of himself, reflected in her silence. And the woman who understands this does not rush to fill the void. She knows the void is her strength. She stands in it, unshaken, like a storm contained in stillness. This is the secret power of a woman's silence. It is not passivity. It is not surrender. It is sovereignty. It is the refusal to be dragged into chaos, the courage to let him feel the weight of his own emptiness, and the wisdom to know that desire grows not in abundance, but in absence. Her silence is not empty. It is a chalice filled with meaning, a sacred vessel into which a man pours all his fears, longings, and projections. When a woman refuses to explain herself, she compels the masculine to wander through his labyrinth without a map. He circles, questions, imagines, each unanswered thought feeding a fire that burns hotter the more it is denied fuel. Jung observed that the unconscious seeks wholeness, and when the anima appears in a man's psyche through a woman, it awakens both fascination and torment. The woman who stands silently before him embodies this torment, because she represents what he cannot integrate, what he cannot own, what remains perpetually beyond reach. Imagine the battlefield of two egos, one eager to be heard, the other desperate to dominate. In the clash of words, victory is temporary, fragile, but when one ego meets silence, the ground shifts. There is no blow to strike, no weapon to wield, no weakness to exploit. He is forced inward, battling not her but himself. The silence unmasks him. Suddenly his anger feels hollow, his arrogance brittle, his neediness exposed. What he thought was power now reveals itself as insecurity. A woman's silence is therefore not withdrawal but strategy. It is the Stoics' refusal to wrestle in the mud of trivialities. Marcus Aurelius once reminded himself, "You always own the option of having no opinion." So too does she exercise this option, not because she lacks thoughts or emotions, but because she knows not all deserve expression. In withholding words, she withholds validation, forcing him to taste the discomfort of being unseen, unheard, uncentered. For some men, this discomfort grows unbearable. They mistake silence for rejection, and in their panic they chase harder, call louder, promise more. They become obsessed not with her, but with what her silence represents, the terrifying possibility that they are not essential. This is why men cannot resist it. Her quiet detachment becomes the forbidden fruit, and the more he tries to possess it, the more it slips away. But here lies the paradox. Silence can awaken obsession, yet it can also reveal the truth of a man's character. Those who are grounded will not collapse beneath it. They will not chase the ghost of reassurance, nor demand her constant presence. Instead, they will respect her space, recognize her sovereignty, and perhaps even reflect upon their own shadows. In such a case, silence ceases to be a weapon and becomes a teacher. It teaches him patience, humility, and self-reliance. You, listening now, must see how silence separates the fleeting from the eternal. The man who values only attention will wither when it is gone. But the man who values essence will stand firm, not threatened by quiet, but intrigued by its depth. He will come to understand that the woman is not withholding herself. She is simply rooted in her own wholeness, a wholeness that does not require his constant affirmation. And yet, do not mistake this for coldness. The silent woman is not a frozen statue, indifferent to the world. Beneath her quiet is fire, but it is a fire she does not squander on those unworthy of its warmth. She is selective, intentional. She does not give her voice to every conflict, nor her heart to every plea. Her silence is not absence of emotion. It is the refinement of emotion, the channeling of it into strength rather than noise. Carl Jung warned of the dangers of projection, How one soul can become the canvas for another's unresolved battles. Silence cuts through these projections like a blade. When a woman remains silent, she refuses to carry his burdens for him. She hands him back his insecurities, his anger, his hunger for validation, and says without words, "These are yours, not mine." In that moment, he is naked before his shadow, forced to reckon with the man he truly is. And is this not the essence of feminine power? To hold a mirror, not a chain. To awaken, not to enslave. The silent woman does not imprison a man. She liberates him from his illusions, if only he dares to see. Yet most do not dare. They would rather rage against the silence than learn from it. But you, yes, you, have a choice. You can spend your life explaining, defending, justifying, wasting your breath on those who will never listen. Or you can step into the higher path of sovereignty, where silence itself becomes your ally. The world will tell you to speak louder, to prove yourself, to beg for understanding. But the wise woman knows, not every battle is worth fighting, not every word deserves to be spoken. A man may fall in love with your laughter, your softness, your beauty, but it is your silence that will test him. It will separate the weak from the strong, the temporary from the timeless. It will reveal whether he seeks a mirror of his ego or the depth of your soul. And in that revelation you will see him clearly, perhaps for the very first time. Silence, when carried with grace, is not simply the absence of words, but the presence of power. It is the deep current beneath still waters, unseen yet irresistible, guiding everything above it. Men, accustomed to noise, both their own and the world's, find themselves disarmed before a woman who does not rush to fill the void. Her refusal to explain or defend unsettles the masculine mind, which craves clarity, structure, and conclusion. Instead, he is left suspended in ambiguity, and in that suspension his psyche begins to unravel. Carl Jung wrote that the shadow, once confronted, reveals both terror and treasure. A woman's silence is the invitation to such a confrontation. When she withdraws her words, she becomes the keeper of mystery, and the man is forced to meet the shadow he has long avoided. He may cloak this confrontation in anger, insisting that her quietness is cruelty. He may demand explanations, desperate for the comfort of certainty. But beneath his protests lies a simple truth. Her silence exposes the fractures in his own self. It is in this exposure that obsession takes root. For what the ego cannot control, it cannot release. The silent woman becomes a haunting figure in his mind. He replays her absence, questions her motives, projects fantasies upon her stillness. Each unanswered question deepens the wound, for the ego feeds not on reality but on interpretation. And when reality remains elusive, interpretation multiplies into obsession. You may think silence is passive, but it is in fact the most active of weapons. Unlike words, which can be dismissed, argued against, or twisted, silence leaves no escape. It does not allow rebuttal. It hangs in the air like a mirror, reflecting not her weakness, but his lack of mastery over himself. In this way, silence is mercilessly honest. It shows him what he does not wish to see, his dependence, his craving, his fragile pride. A woman who embraces silence is not withholding love. She is reclaiming her energy. She no longer bleeds her spirit into endless explanations, no longer spends her life cushioning a man's insecurities. Instead, she stands as a stoic would, sovereign and unshaken. Epictetus reminded his students that what disturbs us is not the events themselves, but the judgments we attach to them. The silent woman embodies this wisdom. She chooses not to enter the storm of another's judgment, choosing instead the unassailable ground of her own composure. For many men, this composure is unbearable. To encounter a woman who does not flinch, who does not crumble under silence herself, is to encounter the limits of their influence. Their usual tools, charm, anger, persuasion, fall useless before her. And so they chase harder, sometimes with rage, sometimes with desperate tenderness. They confuse her silence with rejection, when in truth it is elevation. She has risen above the games, above the endless push and pull of control. But notice this: silence is not cruelty, nor is it punishment. It is a sacred filter. It separates those who can withstand mystery from those who demand constant validation. The man who panics at silence reveals his immaturity, his dependence on reassurance. The man who remains steady, who respects her space, who does not collapse when faced with ambiguity, he reveals a maturity rare and precious. And you, listening now, must understand, silence is not only a tool for relationships, but a path to inner freedom. Each time you resist the urge to over-explain, you reclaim a piece of your soul. Each time you let silence speak instead of your defenses, you strengthen the roots of your own worth. The world conditions women to believe they must always be pleasing, always be clear, always be available. But in silence, that conditioning dissolves. You realize you owe no one constant access to your energy. A man may attempt to define you, to contain you with his words, to tether you with his demands. Yet your silence reminds him and reminds you that you cannot be contained. You are more than his story about you, more than his need for you, more than his fear of losing you. Silence whispers, "I am whole, whether you understand me or not." And in that whisper lies both danger and allure. For nothing captivates the human spirit more than what it cannot fully grasp. The silent woman is not an absence. She is an abyss, and the abyss is magnetic. Jung would say she embodies the anima's mystery, drawing the man deeper into his own unconscious. Whether he rises from this descent transformed or broken depends not on her words, but on his willingness to face himself. Thus, silence becomes the most dangerous of seductions and the most powerful of shields. It is the paradox of presence and absence intertwined. And in mastering it, a woman steps not only into her feminine power, but into her spiritual sovereignty. Silence is not merely a pause in conversation. It is the architecture of power, built brick by brick through restraint, patience, and sovereign detachment. The woman who wields silence with intention stands at the threshold between the ordinary and the extraordinary. She is no longer trapped in the endless cycle of validation and reaction. She has stepped into the timeless domain where stillness itself becomes influence. Carl Jung often spoke of individuation, the process of becoming whole, of integrating the conscious and unconscious. For the feminine, silence can be the crucible in which individuation unfolds. By resisting the compulsion to constantly explain, justify, or appease, she confronts her own shadows, the fear of abandonment, the terror of being misunderstood, the ancestral wound of invisibility. Yet instead of fleeing these shadows, she embraces them. Her silence does not hide her wounds. It transforms them into wisdom. She learns that she is not defined by how others perceive her, nor by how loudly she can defend her place in the world. She is defined by her ability to remain whole, even when the world demands fragments. To the masculine psyche, this silence is intoxicating and infuriating in equal measure. He senses that her quiet detachment is not emptiness but fullness. Fullness of self, fullness of soul, fullness of power. He cannot dominate it because it does not resist him. It simply exists, untouchable, beyond his reach. Like water slipping through clenched fists, her silence cannot be seized. It can only be felt, and in feeling it, he confronts his own limitations. You may wonder, why does this silence haunt him so deeply? Because it dismantles the illusion of control. Men often believe they are the authors of women's emotions, the architects of women's reactions. But when faced with a woman who does not yield her voice on command, he realizes that his influence has limits. Her refusal to fill the air reveals his dependence on her responses. He begins to see that without her participation in his ego games, he is left alone with the truth of himself. And that truth terrifies him. The Stoics understood this. Seneca reminded his students that anger often arises not from injury, but from the expectation of compliance. When a woman meets demands with silence, she does not grant the ego the compliance it expects. She robs anger of its fuel, leaving the man alone with the hollowness of his own entitlement. He may rage louder, but each outburst only amplifies the echo of his own weakness. For you, the choice to embody silence is not about manipulation. It is about liberation. Every time you withhold unnecessary explanations, you reclaim the sacred energy that has been scattered by centuries of conditioning. You reclaim the right to be misunderstood without collapsing, the right to walk away without justifying, the right to exist without apology. This is not cruelty. It is sovereignty, and sovereignty is magnetic. Men who encounter it cannot remain unchanged. Some recoil, threatened by what they cannot control. Others are drawn closer, compelled by the mystery. But all are transformed, for they have glimpsed a force they cannot dominate. They have glimpsed a woman who belongs not to their expectations, but to herself. Do you feel the weight of this power? It is the power of absence, which often shapes more than presence. It is the pause between notes that makes the melody haunting. It is the shadow that gives shape to light. A woman's silence is not void, but depth, and men, though they may fear it, are irresistibly drawn to it. They circle it as moths circle flame, both terrified of and seduced by what they cannot grasp. And here is the paradox. In refusing to speak, she speaks more loudly than any voice. Her silence says, I will not be reduced to reaction. I will not squander my essence on those who cannot hold it. I will not trade my dignity for temporary reassurance. Her silence says, I am whole without you, and it is this wholeness that makes her irresistible. Jung taught that the anima, when integrated, guides a man toward his own soul. The silent woman embodies this guiding force. She does not lure him with flattery or entrap him with words. She calls him inward, toward the cavern of his own unconscious, where he must confront the shadow he has long denied. Whether he rises transformed or remains tormented is not her burden. Her role is not to save, but to stand, and in standing silently, she becomes the threshold he must cross if he dares to evolve. This is why silence is dangerous. This is why it is divine, and this is why men cannot resist it. Silence, when cultivated by a woman who knows her worth, is not a retreat. It is an ascension. It is the final refusal to be trapped in the endless economy of reaction, where every word is weighed against another's expectation. In her silence, she has nothing to prove and nothing to defend. She transcends the battlefield where love is confused with control, where attention masquerades as devotion, and where noise drowns out truth. For the man, her silence becomes unbearable precisely because it dissolves the illusion that she needs him to define her reality. His ego, accustomed to being fed by constant affirmation, suddenly starves. He hears nothing where he expected protest, sees no collapse where he expected submission, and in that nothingness he is confronted with himself, his fear of irrelevance, his hunger for power, his inability to sit with uncertainty. This confrontation is not her cruelty, it is his reckoning. Carl Jung spoke of the anima as the soul image within a man, the feminine archetype that draws him toward wholeness. Yet, when this archetype is projected onto a woman, she often becomes the screen upon which he paints his insecurities and his desires. If she engages endlessly, she risks being swallowed by the weight of his projections. But if she turns instead to silence, she refuses to carry what is not hers. She hands him back his shadows and demands, without words, that he face them. This is why silence feels like abandonment to the insecure, but like sacred space to the mature. The immature man interprets her silence as absence, a rejection of his worth. The mature man sees it as presence, a chance to step into stillness with her, to let go of ego and meet her in a deeper place. Thus, silence does not only test him, it reveals him. It draws out who he truly is when the noise of the world falls away. And you, listening now, must ask yourself, how often have you wasted your breath defending truths that never needed defense? How often have you poured words into a void, hoping to be understood, only to discover that understanding was never his intention? The power of silence is the refusal to participate in that futility. It is the choice to keep your essence intact rather than scatter it in battles that diminish you. A woman who embraces silence learns that she is no longer chained to the performance of constant accessibility. She discovers that her absence is just as powerful as her presence. She begins to see that the pause, the withdrawal, the decision not to speak, these are not signs of weakness, but of strength refined. For in a world that constantly demands noise, choosing silence is the most radical act of all. This silence does not merely affect him, it transforms her. She feels the shift within herself, a calming of the nervous system, a centering of the soul, a remembering that her value does not live in external validation. Each unspoken word becomes a testament to her sovereignty. Each pause becomes a declaration that she belongs to herself first, before she belongs to anyone else. This is individuation in practice, the union of shadow and self, the emergence of wholeness. Men, of course, cannot resist this. They are drawn not to the silence itself, but to what it represents. It represents a woman beyond their control, a woman they cannot define, a woman who does not orbit around their ego. She is mystery embodied, and mystery awakens desire. For what is forbidden becomes magnetic, and what cannot be controlled becomes unforgettable. But here is the deeper truth. Silence is not for him. It is for you. It is the sanctuary you create when the world becomes too loud, the shield you raise when others demand too much, the well from which your strength is drawn. He may chase it, fear it, or fall apart before it, but ultimately it is not his to own. It is yours to wield. And as you stand in this silence, you realize something extraordinary. You are no longer afraid of being misunderstood. You no longer fear his anger, his confusion, or his withdrawal. You have stepped beyond the need for explanation. In this freedom, obsession no longer belongs to you, it belongs to him. You are no longer the prisoner of his attention. He becomes the prisoner of your silence. This is the paradox Jung would have recognized, that in losing the noise, you gain the power. That in withdrawing your words you expand your influence, that in silence you find not emptiness but sovereignty. The woman who understands this no longer chases, no longer pleads, no longer bends. She knows that her silence does more than words ever could, and so she stands, whole and untouchable, a mystery the masculine can neither resist nor contain. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.